Mercato Be Tirita.
ሰላም ጤና ይስጥልን እንደምንላችኋል ውድ አድማጮቻችን መርካቶ በትርታ መሰናዷችን በትርታ 97.6 ኤፍኤም አሁን ጀምሯል። የዛሬ መሰናዷችን ከሌላው ቀን ለየት የሚያደርገው እንግዳችን የአሜሪካዊ የዩኤስ ኤምባሲ የኢኮኖሚክ ኦፊሰር ናቸው። ቆይታችንን ከሳቸው ጋር በእንግሊዝኛ ነው የምናደርገው። ይሄንኑ ቆይታ ወደ አማርኛ ተርጉመን ቀጣይ መሰናዷችን ላይ የምናቀርበው ይሆናል። so this is Tirita 97.6 FM and it's our lunch hour business show Mercato Be Tirita. Today I'm joined by Donald Kim from the Embassy of the United States of America. He's an economic officer at the embassy, and we're going to have a discussion regarding macroeconomy, regarding the current, the recently adopted foreign exchange regime, the floating foreign exchange regime, and other pertinent issues.
Tirita 97.6 FM.
We're back on Tirita 97.6 FM. This is the lunch hour business show, Mercato Be Tirita. Today I have my guest, Donald Kim from the U.S. Embassy. He's the economic officer. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, bro.
All right. So let's start our conversation. I would prefer to call it a conversation. And let's start our conversation by telling us a little bit about yourself. I mean, you are the economic officer at the U.S. Embassy right now, and what was your experience? I mean, before Ethiopia and things like that, and then we'll go deeper.
Oh, sure. So I started off as the economic officer here at the embassy in Addis almost exactly a year ago, actually. I arrived August 24th of 2023. Mm-hmm. And then after about 10 months, I took a different job to be the economic chief. So I'm now leading the economic units. I took my predecessor's job when he left in June. So this is my first time in Africa, actually, working here in Addis. So it's been quite a learning curve. It's very interesting. Prior to being here in Ethiopia, I was most recently in Washington, working at the state headquarters in Washington. Mm-hmm. Before that, I was working in Mexico City, doing more of the political aspect of the job. And then before that, I was in a city called Shenyang, China, which is in the northeast. It's a town most Americans I know have not heard of, even though it has more people than New York, I believe. It's something like 7 or 8 million people. Okay. But those are cities in China. Yeah. So I was working there for a couple of years before that. And then before that, I was an economist for many years in different departments within the U.S. government.
Yeah. Okay. So I would say a lot is happening in Ethiopia. I mean, I would say it would be an understatement. But there's a lot happening, and exactly a month ago, I mean, I was checking the calendar earlier this morning, and a month ago, Ethiopia's long-awaited forex regime shifted from fixed to floating, and I mean, it was lots of people were caught by surprise. I mean, nobody expected it to. People were expecting it to happen, but not this soon. What are the implications? I mean, in general terms, what do you see in regards to this policy shift?
Well, so I would say you were not alone in being surprised. Yeah. We have been following this very closely the entire time I've been here, and even before I arrived, the U.S. Embassy was following it, along with our colleagues from other embassies. We've been following this very closely. So I would say even we were caught by surprise, not so much by the timing, but how much Ethiopia did and the depth of what they did. So I think the expectation up to a month ago was that Ethiopia, if they did do some kind of reform of the exchange rate, would be to maybe devalue the birr 20, 30%. And then that's not exactly optimal in economic terms. It just really creates more uncertainty. It creates a lot of currency speculation. So our hope was that Ethiopia would decide to completely float the birr the way they did, but honestly, we were not expecting it, let alone the other reforms they also made at the same time. Yeah. So it's caught everybody surprised. I would say it even caught the Ethiopian banks by surprise. Yeah. We know that it even caught the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia by surprise, despite being state-owned. Yeah. In terms of the implications, it's not uncommon for countries to have a fixed exchange rate. Yeah. So that in and of itself is not a problem. China also has a fixed exchange rate, for example. But it does become a problem when you're in a situation where where your country is not exporting very much and importing a lot, which is the case in Ethiopia. Yeah. So by having that kind of economic model for many, many years, by having the exchange rate be fixed on top of it, you start to run out of dollars. And that's what we've been seeing, especially the last, I would say, 5 years, where Ethiopia just did not have the foreign currency it needed to cover the massive amounts of imports that it had. And that is why we saw this emergence of the parallel market.
Yeah.
So by doing the floating rates, in theory, you should eventually get rid of that black market, which we're already starting to see. The parallel market rate is basically the same as what the banks are offering now.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's good. It's never really good from an economic standpoint to fight the law of supply and demand, which is what they were doing by having these two exchange rates. So I think in terms, in the long term, it is definitely from an economic standpoint, the wiser thing to do.
Yeah. The banks, you said, were surprised, like everybody else. I mean, however, when you look at the country's economic progress, especially for the past 5 years, I mean, there is the COVID aftershock, there is the war in different parts of the country, and that took its toll on the country's economy, obviously. And the manufacturing sector is having serious issues. Logistics is a problem, coupled with uncertainty in the market. I mean, it's not just the war in Ethiopia, the Russian and the Ukraine war, the instability in the Middle East. All these factors took its toll on the Ethiopian economy, I would say. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
In that regard, would an exchange rate policy shift, say, would it be the silver bullet?
Nothing is a silver bullet when you talk about the economy. National economies are a very finicky thing. It's very rare that you can fix all the problems of an economy just by fixing one thing. A lot of things have to go right if you want to create a robust economy. So no, it is not a silver bullet. However, I would say that the existence of the two exchange rates was pervasive throughout the economy. And you could see how it just affected really almost any aspect you talk about when you talk about the economy. So no, it's not a silver bullet. And all the things that you mentioned, they are still problems. Manufacturing sector is still an issue. Logistics is still an issue. But at least by moving to this floating exchange rate, you can start to address, I would say, more easily fixed problems within the economy. Now, where they go from here, that's a separate issue. And it is a much longer term issue. But I think that despite the fact that it doesn't serve as a silver bullet, it is a step in the right direction.
So there are Ethiopian economists, who are for and against the current policy shift. Some of them are really strong supporters of the policy shift, say those in the academia, I mean university professors and other independent economics, so to speak. While there are others who are against the whole idea. I mean, this is detrimental. It's like opening the Pandora's box or something like that. They have been saying lots of things. And what do you see? I mean, is there some sort of a common ground? I mean, I'm sure there are risks. I'm sure there are issues that will eventually arise with regards to this policy shift. So, are the concerns of those against the policy shift legitimate?
Potentially. They are. So I think one of the arguments for fixed exchange rates, and this goes back to Bretton Woods in 1944, has always been that if you don't have fixed exchange rates, that leads to price volatility. So that's always a concern, especially when you have an economy that needs to produce more. So I think that is probably what they're really worried about. They're almost definitely worried about inflation as well, because Ethiopia does import so many items, both in terms of consumer goods, but also critical inputs like fuel and fertilizer, that does potentially lead to more inflation. Now, the government is taking action, at least in terms of fuel, by subsidizing, which is why you see that the prices of fuel have been the same. The consumer goods, I think that one thing that we should really consider is that everybody was already operating at the parallel market rate. So an importer, if you're importing some X good from Saudi Arabia, China, U.S., wherever, they had to pay the black market rate in order to get in here, and they pass that on to the consumers.
Yeah.
So that's why I think we have seen a little bit of inflation immediately after the reforms were announced, but a lot of that was price gouging, first of all.
Yeah.
And then second of all, I think a lot of it started to calm down as people started to register what the exchange rate reform actually meant.
Yeah. So what does this mean in regards to FDI? I mean, Ethiopia has been talking about FDI for the past 2 decades plus. I mean, trying to attract foreign direct investment. And you have FDI from Turkey, from Saudi Arabia, from China, from India, from the US. And would this boost FDI? How would, say, American investors see this policy shift?
It definitely makes Ethiopia more attractive as a destination for FDI.
Why?
So because many companies that would otherwise be interested in Ethiopia, when they looked at the exchange rate and said, well, I can invest $1 and get 57 birr when I know I'm supposed to be getting 118, no investor is going to make that decision. Most of the U.S. companies that were here were already here before the gap got really big. So when we would talk before the reforms, when we would talk to companies or people who represented companies from any country, really, they all said, we want to come into Ethiopia because of the size of the market, because of the potential, but because of foreign exchange, we can't. So I often heard from people from Germany, from India, from Turkey, we're all just waiting for the exchange rate to be fixed.
Okay. So you said earlier something about subsidies. The government, I mean, everybody has heard about this structural adjustment program by the IMF, which the policy prescription for the government was lift the cap on, say privatization, liberalization of strategic and state-owned enterprises, fixing, devaluing the birr was one, and lifting subsidies was another. So they did that, especially when it comes to fuel. They were gradually lifting subsidies. I mean, like a year and a half ago, 1 liter, we use the metric system here, so 1 liter of fuel, gas was, say, 28 birr or 30 birr. Now it's above 80 birr. I mean, that the government officially announced that it is lifting subsidies. Now the government resorting back to putting subsidies on strategic and certain areas, including fuel. So isn't that like a U-turn from the IMF's policy prescription? And it's the IMF who always wanted the Ethiopian government to float the currency regime.
Right. So I think the IMF recognizes that in that sense it is a U-turn, but it's a necessary step to prevent the reforms from affecting the poor segment of society too much.
Yeah.
It's not ideal in an economic sense. You don't like to see subsidies propping up something that should be priced higher. But in this particular case, because of the immediate impact it would have on the poor segment of Ethiopian society, they determined it was fine. Now, there is a plan for the government to wind these back the way they did previously. So within, I think, probably about a year, they're going to start winding these back with the idea that the reforms would have had time to really kind of trickle throughout the entire economy so that they become less necessary, and that more foreign investment would bring in extra money so that hopefully they would raise up the economy as a whole. One thing I should mention is that when they rolled back the subsidies, it's interesting because they were still subsidizing it, but just more on the monetary foreign exchange side of it, because they were paying this official rate to get their fuel from whatever countries, but everybody knew these were not the actual exchange rates. So they were subsidizing it just in a different way.
So change is tricky. I mean, whenever there is change in any sector, it could turn out to be really bad for the economy. And people have been mentioning the countries like Uzbekistan, where they transitioned from a fixed exchange rate regime to a managed floating exchange rate regime in 2017. And they have been doing a pretty good job. And others mention countries like Nigeria and Argentina, where similar policy shifts ended up fueling inflation. Like, I mean, the general public, I mean, in Nigeria, in Argentina, really faced or felt the backlash. And so what should Ethiopia do, trying to mitigate? And it's like walking on thin ice. I mean, it might crack it might break. So how do you survive such policy shifts in the short term and in the long term?
Well, so in the short term, actually, even going back, what Ethiopia did that a lot of other countries that have done similar projects did not do was for a good probably year, maybe even a year and a half, they were actually trying to reduce liquidity in the monetary markets. So they were pulling not just dollars, but also birr out of the market. And I think that's a good reason why you didn't see such a huge increase in inflation in Ethiopia the way you did in some of the other countries. Because there just wasn't the money to do so. And, that created other problems, but at least it did solve the immediate inflationary crisis that you saw in some of these other countries. With Nigeria in particular, they initially did not float. I believe they devalued a couple times, but all they really did was make the official rate equal to the black market rate, which just created a new gap just at a higher rate for the official rate. And then I think they did it maybe one other time before they finally floated it. So that was kind of not an ideal solution for the reasons I mentioned earlier. It just creates currency speculation. Everybody knows that that's not the real rate. Argentina is a very interesting case. One thing that I think Argentina has done that has created a lot of problems is just they spend too much. They spend way beyond their means.
Define spending. I mean,
a lot of programs designed to make themselves look good to the Argentinian people. And you could argue that Ethiopia is doing the same thing with the fuel subsidies, but again, that is underpinned by the IMF and World Bank support. So this is kind of built into that program. Whereas Argentina, they like to do a lot of flashy spending, increasing welfare programs for their people, but then not really having a financial basis to back it up. So the hope is that with Ethiopia, what they should do is try to exercise more fiscal restraints than the countries that have not been successful have. And that is one of the approaches that they need to take in order to make sure this is successful.
So one brief overview. So what do you think should be the role of the central bank? I mean, after this, the central bank main job is to regulate monetary policy, and now they're saying that we're no longer going to control you in regards to forex. What should be the role of the central bank in regards to foreign exchange?
So the role of the central bank, a lot of times in many countries, is just to control the flow of money, basically, as opposed to what the national bank was doing here, which was creating a bunch of really distortionary policies in order to preserve the little forex that they had. So now that they're freed of that role, it does enable them to operate more as a central bank should, which is just to make sure that there's not too much money, but also enough money flowing through the system. I think one of the other things that we don't talk about as much, because forex dominates the whole discussion, is the requirement that the national bank become more independent. So it's no longer required to just provide money to the Ministry of Finance, for example. That's a really good move, we think, to have the central bank be independent, to make their own judgments based on what they see as being the actual monetary pressure within the economy.
So you're listening to Tirita 97.6 FM. This is Mercato Be Tirita, the lunchtime business show. I'm here with Donald Kim from the Embassy of the United States of America. He's the chief economist at the embassy. He's the economic officer. So we are having conversations regarding macroeconomy, regarding foreign exchange rate regime, and we'll take a short break.
ትርታ 97.6 FM ከልቡ የቀረበ
We're back from our messages. You are tuned into Tirita 97.6 FM. I'm here with Donald Kim, economic officer at the Embassy of the United States, and you are listening to Mercato Be Tirita, the lunchtime business show. So, to pick up from where we left off, let's explore further into what this means to U.S. businesses. You highlighted it earlier. Ethiopia would be more attractive for U.S. investors, but what are the opportunities for someone who has been here in Addis for almost a year now? You've seen how business is conducted here in Ethiopia, and what are the opportunities for U.S. investors, and what are the problems here in the Ethiopian business circles? What should be fixed? Your perspective.
So in terms of opportunities, anytime you have a country as large as Ethiopia, American businesses are going to see the size of the potential market. There are companies that have been operating in Ethiopia And they've been reasonably successful. So Coca-Cola comes to mind, Boeing comes to mind. But because of, first of all, the conflicts, but also because of the foreign exchange rate problems, a lot of other companies that would otherwise want to come in have been dissuaded from doing so. So when you eliminate the foreign exchange problem, that creates more interest on their part. There are a number of companies that have been talking about getting involved in mining in Ethiopia. The conflicts, again, cause problems there because, if you're trying to do gold in Oromia or Tigray, then that obviously is going to create problems. But I think that other companies that do things like consumer goods, restaurant chains, they might be very interested in coming into Ethiopia as well. Now, in terms of the challenges, as I said before, an economy is not just one aspect. You can't just fix one aspect and then expect your economy to boom. Very few countries have been able to make that transition from low, middle to a developed economy. So it's very difficult to do. Some of the challenges that exist in Ethiopia, the main thing that we hear from companies from all over the world, not just U.S. companies, is the business environment. So it's very difficult for companies to come in and do business, both because of just standard low-level corruption, or just and also really the land rights issue here in Ethiopia. So companies in the U.S., they are used to being able to get a lease on a factory and just that is their lease. Whereas in Ethiopia, a number of companies from all types of countries have experienced cases where they start to build something on land that was agreed to, and then the local people come in and say that they want that land because they see something of value being built there. Or a corrupt official says, okay, you need to pay an insane amount of tax because we see that you're being successful. So this kind of speaks both to land rights but also to the rule of law and agreeing to contracts. No U.S. company, but really no market-based, no profit-seeking company is going to be able to operate in that type of environment. Customs and logistics are another issue here. So customs is kind of notorious, to be honest, in Ethiopia among foreign companies for changing regulations just the morning of and saying that, this cargo that you have sitting in Djibouti can't come in because the paperwork has changed. Well, when it takes a few weeks for something to get to Djibouti, and even longer now because of all the stuff that's going on in the Red Sea, that's not reasonable and that's not feasible. So companies do not like that kind of unpredictability. They want to see something that can create a stable rate of return.
So do you see the land policy changing anytime soon? I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer, I can understand, but still it's a major issue. I mean, you have observed that we have been talking to lots of businesses here in the country, and they also have similar problems. I mean, what would be a win-win for both for the government and for the companies? What sort of arrangement do you see happening?
I think what I would really urge policymakers in Ethiopia to do is to make sure that they're being responsive to companies' complaints, requests, whatever they have to say. What we're seeing too often right now is a company has a legitimate complaint about something, let's say land rights, and goes to one of the Ethiopian entities that's supposed to handle that, and they get, we'll do something, we'll fix it tomorrow, and then nothing happens. And, that's just not an environment that is welcoming to business. And, companies, they talk. They hear about what's going on, not just in Ethiopia, but any country. So if they hear that, if I go to Ethiopia, I'm going to lose my investment and they're not going to do anything about it, they're not going to invest. And they'll go to Kenya, where, they have heard that they have a very welcoming business environment. So that's a very key problem for Ethiopia that they could fix very quickly. That's kind of one of those low-hanging fruit that they could address, is to make sure that they're being responsive to the issues that companies face here.
So you can't eat and have the cake,
Exactly.
So if you have to make changes, then you have to make changes. So what would be the role of the U.S. Embassy in regards to facilitating this? I mean, say, trying to show what opportunities exists here in Ethiopia, especially for U.S. investors. I mean, delegations from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce from different cities in the U.S., they've been coming here, they've been engaging with the businesses, the government. Did that bear fruit, or just a meet and greet type of session?
I mean, so it's difficult, but we haven't had a chance to really do anything since the reforms. The reforms are kind of a game changer for a lot of these things. So the ambassador one of his kind of objectives is to host with the government of Ethiopia a high-level business forum in late January. And this would involve not just the U.S. and not just the West, but private sector from all over the world. Because everybody...
And the U.S. is taking the lead?
No, actually, the government of Ethiopia is taking the lead. Okay. So this is their project. The Ministry of Finance is taking the lead on this, and we're happy to let them take the lead. This is their country. They should be taking the lead. So we're happy to offer any kind of assistance we can, and to get the word out among U.S. businesses. And we've been encouraging our partners in other embassies and other chambers of commerce to also do the same with their private sector to get the word out. So it's been... this is one of his primary kind of initiatives for the coming year to get this high-level business forum set up. And what we would like to do, what we'd like to see is, first of all, let the private sector know that Ethiopia is open for business, that they are moving forward and making these reforms that they need to become a truly market-based economy, and hopefully in the future become a truly welcoming business environment. And that's a win-win we see for everybody. The pie will get bigger in Ethiopia. Companies will be able to profit from a very huge, dynamic, and young market. So that's where we're hoping to go forward. Now, there's a limit to how much we can do, even as the U.S. Ethiopia has to partner with us. They have to cooperate on a lot of these other issues that we've discussed already. But I'm optimistic. I think that they are moving in the right direction. When we talk to folks in the government, we know that there are people who know what they're doing. They really are understanding of what they need to do to really...
Has there been a time that the U.S. has been really optimistic in regards to what's happening in Ethiopia? When was the last time that the U.S. was optimistic?
That's a very good question. Besides the reforms, I would say that immediately after the cessation of hostilities agreements, the U.S. was pretty optimistic about the direction that things were going, just because the northern conflict had been terrible for both sides. But unfortunately, immediately after that, issues started arising in Amhara and Oromia. And we don't take sides on any of those. We would just like to see a cessation of conflict in general, just because that's what's best for Ethiopians, regardless of your ethnicity. We don't like to see any type of conflict. So that was probably the last time. I would say that we did have a sense in 2018 that there were some movements toward privatization, so in the economic space. But unfortunately, COVID, the conflicts did start to supersede that.
So let's talk about banking. Now Ethiopia is finalizing the paperwork to invite foreign banks to come and operate here in Ethiopia. That is something big, something new for the country. I've talked to Ethiopian bankers. Now, most of them, they're saying that they're ready. They're saying that they're ready. There are challenges, but they're ready. They talk about mergers and other things that they are considering. Maybe they're moving towards that direction. I'm not sure, but they are looking at it from an optimistic perspective. So, what does this mean for Ethiopia? I mean, would Ethiopian banks be able to challenge, banks, from the UAE, from South Africa, from Kenya, Nigeria? I mean, I see these countries being the first ones to enter the banking sector.
Sure.
Be it investment banking, be it wholesale retail banking, commercial banking. So what's next on the plate for Ethiopian banks?
Well, the Ethiopian banking sector up to now has been very interesting. I was actually kind of surprised to see how the model worked here. I think for a country as large as Ethiopia, that implies an extremely complex banking system. So in that sense, having banks from other countries that are more accustomed to working in what I would call a more international banking context is going to be very helpful for Ethiopian banks. When we have spoken to some of the private banks here in Ethiopia, they've expressed the same thing, optimism, which is, they have told me, we recognize that we have a long way to go, but they're learning fast. And I would say that in general of Ethiopia, even with such far-reaching reforms, Ethiopians are really adjusting very quickly to what it's like to operate in a market economy. I think that if the partnership model is a good one. And that's one that a lot of U.S. companies have hoped to get involved in with Ethiopia, not just to come in and invest and then leave, but to come in to partner with Ethiopian companies, kind of have this exchange of ideas so that Ethiopia, the benefit they would get out of it is learning how to operate in an international context, which maybe they haven't had before because of some of the other issues that they had with the economy.
Yeah.
So I think that as the banks come in, and right now we haven't heard a lot of interest from U.S. banks yet, but as Ethiopia moves forward, you will start to see that.
Do you have like U.S. banks presence in Africa?
Not right now.
Yeah.
No. There was some discussions, but the foreign exchange issue always came up.
Yeah, because I've never come across a U.S. bank like fully operating in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they might do correspondence banking or work with banks, but you don't see a U.S. bank here in Ethiopia or in Africa in general.
Right.
But you have your Standard Bank in South Africa. You have your UBA, your Zenith, Access Bank in Nigeria. Huge banks, really big banks, and including investment banks, because that's a whole new ballgame for the Ethiopian banking sector. I mean, there has never been an investment bank here in Ethiopia. There are local ones who are working towards the establishment of an investment bank. A couple of business people are doing that. You also have UAE banks. I've heard that they have shown some serious interest coming into Ethiopia and be part of the financial services sector. And in that regard, say, you also have another thing. We also have another thing coming in the near future. That will be the Ethiopian Securities Exchange. Ethiopia is new to this type of institution. What should be expected? It's a broad question, I know.
Sure. So, in terms of the Security Exchange, we've spoken with Talahun over at the Securities Exchange. He's very ambitious, and I think he has a really good plan in place. He's not aiming small, but he's also not aiming too big. So he's starting off with the insurance companies and the banks, and then wants to keep it relatively restrained at first to make sure that this is a model that can work. And then as that becomes more successful, then they would start to expand. So I think that they have a really good idea in place for that. So in terms of the U.S. banks, despite their reputation for being kind of freewheeling when it comes to creating new derivatives and tools in the U.S., when it comes to entering a market, they're pretty conservative.
Yeah.
So they don't want to go to a place where they're worried about things like conflicts.
Yeah.
So I think it's to their loss so far that they haven't been more involved in Africa.
Yeah.
But again, they have shareholders to answer to, so shareholders get very, very jittery when they talk about things like conflict.
Yeah. So that's something, I don't know, maybe U.S. banks should look into. I don't know. Or buy a stake. That would be their choice. So what's the future outlook? What do you see, say, 5 years from now, 7 years from now, say by 2030? Where do you see the Ethiopian economy? If things go according to plan, and if things don't go according to plan?
Sure. So really, I would aim more kind of closer in the future. I would look more toward like a year from now.
Okay.
So a year from now, when they start to roll back the subsidies and when they start to roll back some of the assistance of the social safety net that they've included in this IMF World Bank program and in their own program, that's when we're going to start to see, has Ethiopia made the changes that they need to really start moving the economy in a more market-based, kind of more integrated path.
Yeah.
So if they do things right and kind of create a more welcoming business environment, you can expect to see a lot of interest from foreign companies to come in, a lot of dollars flowing in, a lot of foreign currency flowing in. Ethiopia is just too big and too dynamic and too young to be on the sidelines. So if they do things right, I could see them starting to make progress, developing certain sectors that would help them to bring more money and, again, just kind of raise all boats, so help all the Ethiopian people.
Yeah.
If they don't do it right, then you'll start to see, some of the other failed IMF programs in other countries where all it is just more debt for the Ethiopians to pay back.
Yeah.
And that's definitely a concern. But at least I would say Ethiopia, just by making the reforms that they did, it really has caught us by surprise that they were willing to go forward in just the most liberalizing way. And we view that as a positive. If they'd kind of done it piecemeal, then I'd be a lot more concerned.
So what would be your response, say, inflation? There was price gouging, you mentioned that earlier, but still inflation is just around the corner. You never know when it's going to pop. I mean,
right.
it might go through the roof, say, in a couple of weeks or in a couple of months. And what's your advice to policymakers? I mean, how can they control things when they see that it's going to be a little bit difficult to manage. I mean, I always say the market is a different monster. It acts and reacts in a certain way that you can't even predict at times. So, what should be the advice for policymakers?
Inflation is hard. I mean, inflation is, even in the U.S., when we had inflation after COVID, it took us a long time to get it down to normal. And only really just the last month that it came back down to normal. So, as you said, it's a huge beast. It has a lot of different moving parts that make it difficult to control. What I would like to see, actually, is not so much from the policymakers, but from Ethiopian companies and the Ethiopian entrepreneurs. So, for example, earlier I mentioned that edible oils, I think I mentioned that. If I didn't, edible oils is something that Ethiopia imports. They import something like 90% of the edible oils.
Yeah.
There's no reason for that.
Yeah.
You make plenty, you export oil seeds. So why can't Ethiopia make its own oil? So, normally what would happen in these environments, as you have this market's motive, people should start to recognize the potential to make their own edible oils and sell them locally. So, that's kind of the hope when you do these types of reforms, is that by creating this market incentive, some entrepreneur will say, hey, I can make oil here. I can make fertilizer here. That's another thing that Ethiopia could pretty easily make internally and not have to import from Morocco. And I think that because of the exchange rates, all these issues of the cost of bringing in imports, that has been a real dampener on the incentive for business owners to create these homegrown businesses. But that's what I would urge folks to start considering, is like, what can I do? For policymakers, get out of their way. Don't interfere with their business. Make it a welcoming environment so that they can actually do these and not have to worry that something's going to happen to their business despite their best efforts.
The rhetoric has always been there. I mean, Ethiopia has been talking about import substitution, like strategically thinking. You can substitute edible oil, you can substitute fertilizers. I mean, we have been saying this for like far too long, and it hasn't materialized. What's the problem? I mean, where do you see the problem is? The will is there.
Yeah, I recognize the problem, and I think that this is kind of this is a common problem as well. Is that we kind of alluded to some issues with the tax earlier. When you are in an environment where companies are afraid to get too big because they'll get taxed too much, I mean, that's not good. I mean, some people may say, "Oh, good, let's tax the businesses," but no, that's penalizing success, and that is one of the worst things you can do if you want to actually create a successful economy, right? So I think what they need to do is they need to make sure that there is an incentive, which can be as simple as just not overtaxing businesses. For someone to say, okay, I can actually create a viable business. I can make money off of this. I can support my family doing something like edible oils. And I feel like that has not always existed in Ethiopia because of, all kinds of issues.
So we talk about taxes. I mean, that's a very interesting topic, and there has been tax reforms for the past couple of years. I mean, things are changing. Some say that it's a bit too much for the average Ethiopian to handle. I mean, there is this one property tax that's just around the corner. I mean, the coming Ethiopian year, when Parliament reconvenes, one of the first laws to be passed is going to be the property tax law. From the government's perspective, I mean, I would understand you have to expand your tax regime. There is this budget deficit, and you have to narrow the gap. We've heard that being said. Would the Ethiopian taxpayer be able to carry the burden of this new tax on top of the ones that are still existing? Or do you see Ethiopia's tax system being too small to begin with?
Well, we know that the tax revenues are too small. They're half, basically, of where they should be. I think the conflicts have created a lot of problems because places that normally would be paying tax are not, and they're not going into the coffers of the federal government. So that's definitely one issue. I think that in terms of the average Ethiopian's ability to pay the tax, that's definitely a concern. They've talked about making sure that the threshold at which you start to pay tax is high enough so that it doesn't create this disincentive to work, basically. And that's a really tricky thing to manage. We struggle with it in the U.S. as well. I think that expanding the tax base is overall a good idea, but it is understandably very difficult.
Should be properly managed.
Properly managed. And I think that is the kind of thing where as they make these reforms, they need to closely monitor how it's actually affecting business in Ethiopia and how it's affecting the average person.
Yeah. You just mentioned about penalizing success. I mean, we've heard the top 1% or that the elite or the business elite, they're the ones who are making a lot of money, while it's the average Joe who's paying half of his income in taxes. And where do you see that, like, where do you strike that balance when it comes to the Ethiopian business environment or the Ethiopian tax regime? Because there are big businesses who pay their taxes but still are required to pay more than what they're currently paying. Where do you see that change coming in the Ethiopian tax regime?
So this is always difficult as well. It's tempting to say just whoever makes the most money should just have to pay, an exorbitant amount, but that's a disincentive to do business. I can't give percentages, obviously, but it's when a business is saying they cannot operate viably in Ethiopia because they're paying too much in taxes. I mean, that's that's a pretty easy fix to make. And I think, again, a lot of this is, some of this is just kind of run-of-the-mill corruption, and it's just kind of not enough influence over the people who actually go out and collect the tax. So if you talk to a company and they have some tax collector come out and say you owe X amount in tax, and it's basically more than they make in a year, and then the tax collector says, well, this is the tax, I'm not going to show you the paperwork I did to come up with this number, I'm not going to give you a receipt when you pay the tax, that's obviously a huge problem. At least create some kind of paper trail so that the business has a recourse if it turns out they've paid too much.
Okay. So, Donald Kim, thank you for coming on the show. It has been a very interesting conversation. I know there is a lot to cover, but it's just a 1 hour show, so we'll leave it here, and I would like to thank our audience for staying with us. You've been listening to Tirita 97.6 FM, and the show was Mercato Be Tirita, the lunch hour business show. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Safaricom Ethiopia, and Nat Bank, and Ayat Real Estate, for sponsoring the show. So thank you for coming. Do you have any last words?
Oh, no, thank you. I just want to let the Ethiopian people know that the U.S., we're on your side. We're here. So we're happy about these reforms, and we hope that we can collaborate and just work for the good of all the Ethiopian people.
All right. Thank you very much.